Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Do you remember that old Tom the gardener once mentioned to Nancy that long years ago Aunt Polly had quarreled with a lover? From watching the way Mr. Pendleton has softened under Pollyanna's sweet friendship, Nancy has decided that the old lover was Mr. Pendleton. She tells Pollyanna, and of course the tender-hearted girl wants to do whatever she can to reconcile the lovers, so they will both be less lonely and more able to find gladness in the world. But no one could be more surprised about this perfectly logical supposition than Mr. Pendleton himself. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 17. Just like a book. John Pendleton greeted Pollyanna today with a smile.
"Well, Miss Pollyanna, I'm thinking you must be a very forgiving little person, else you wouldn't have come to see me again today."
"Why, Mr. Pendleton, I was real glad to come, and I'm sure I don't see why I shouldn't be either."
"Oh, well, I was pretty cross with you, I'm afraid. Both the other day when you so kindly brought me the jelly, and that time when you found me with the broken leg at first. By the way, too, I don't think I've ever thanked you for that. Now, I'm sure that even you would admit that you were very forgiving to come and see me after such ungrateful treatment as that."
Pollyanna stirred uneasily. "But I was glad to find you. That is, I don't mean I was glad your leg was broken, of course," she corrected hurriedly.
John Pendleton smiled. "I understand. Your tongue does get away with you once in a while, doesn't it, Miss Pollyanna? I do thank you, however, and I consider you are a very brave little girl to do what you did that day. I thank you for the jelly, too," he added in a lighter voice.
"Did you like it?" asked Pollyanna with interest.
"Very much. I suppose there isn't any more today that Aunt Polly didn't send, is there?" he asked with an odd little smile.
His visitor looked distressed. "No, sir," she hesitated, then went on with heightened color. "Please, Mr. Pendleton, I didn't mean to be rude the other day when I said Aunt Polly did not send the jelly." There was no answer. John Pendleton was not smiling now. He was looking straight ahead of him with eyes that seemed to be gazing through and beyond the object before them. After a time he drew a long sigh and turned to Pollyanna. When he spoke, his voice carried the old nervous fretfulness.
Well, this will never do at all. I didn't send for you to see me moping this time. Listen, out in the library, the big room where the telephone is, you'll find a carved box on the lower shelf of the big case with glass doors in the corner not far from the fireplace. That is, it'll be there if that confounded woman hasn't regulated it to somewhere else. You may bring it to me. It is heavy, but not too heavy for you to carry, I think."
"Oh, I'm awfully strong," declared Pollyanna cheerfully, as she sprang to her feet. In a minute she had returned with the box. It was a wonderful half-hour that Pollyanna spent then. The box was full of treasures, curios that John Pendleton had picked up in years of travel, and concerning each there was some entertaining story, whether it were a set of exquisitely carved chessmen from China or a little jade figure from India. It was after she had heard the story about the figure that Pollyanna murmured wistfully, "Well, I suppose it would be better to take a little boy in India to bring up, one that didn't know any more than to think that God was in that doll thing, than it would be to take Jimmy Bean, a little boy who knows God is up in the sky. Still, I can't help wishing that they had wanted Jimmy Bean too, besides the India boys." John Pendleton did not seem to hear. Again his eyes were staring straight before him, looking at nothing. But soon he had roused himself and had picked up another curio to talk about. The visit certainly was a delightful one, but before it was over, Pollyanna was realizing that they were talking about something besides the wonderful things in the beautifully carved box. They were talking of herself, of Nancy, of Aunt Polly, and of her daily life. They were talking, too, even, of the life and home long ago in the far western town. Not until it was nearly time for her to go did the man say, in a voice Pollyanna had never before heard from stern John Pendleton, "Little girl, I want you to come to see me often, will you? I'm lonesome, and I need you. There's another reason, and I'm going to tell you that too. I thought at first, after I found out who you were the other day, that I didn't want you to come any more. You reminded me of something I've tried for long years to forget. So I said to myself that I never wanted to see you again. And every day when the doctor asked if I wouldn't let him bring you to me, I said no. But after a time I found I was wanting to see you so much that the fact that I wasn't seeing you was making me remember all the more vividly the thing I was so wanting to forget. So now I want you to come. Will you, little girl?" Why, yes, Mr. Pendleton," breathed Pollyanna, her eyes luminous with sympathy for the sad-faced man lying back on the pillow before her. "I'd love to come." "Thank you," said John Pendleton gently. After supper that evening, Pollyanna, sitting on the back porch, told Nancy all about Mr. John Pendleton's wonderful carved box and the still more wonderful things it contained. "And to think," sighed Nancy, "that he showed you all of them things and told you about 'em like that. Him that's so cross he never talks to no one. No one." "Oh, but he isn't cross, Nancy. Only outside," demurred Pollyanna with quick loyalty. "I don't see why everybody thinks he's so bad, either. They wouldn't if they knew him. But even Aunt Polly doesn't like him very well. She wouldn't send the jelly to him, you know, and she was so afraid he'd think she did send it." "Probably she didn't call him no duty," shrugged Nancy. "But what beats me is how he happened to take to you so, Miss Pollyanna. Meaning no offense to you, of course. But he ain't the sort of man who generally takes to kids, he ain't. Pollyanna smiled happily. "But he did, Nancy," she nodded. "Only I reckon even he didn't want to, all the time. Why, only today he owned up that one time he just felt he never wanted to see me again, because I reminded him of something he wanted to forget. But afterwards—" "What's that?" interrupted Nancy excitedly. "He said you reminded him of something he wanted to forget?" "Yes, but afterwards—" "What was it?" Nancy was eagerly insistent. "He didn't tell me. He just said it was something." "The mystery!" breathed Nancy in an awestruck voice. "That's why he took to you in the first place. Oh, Miss Pollyanna, why, that's just like a book. I've read lots of 'em. Lady Maud's Secret and The Lost Heir and Hidden for Years. All of 'em had mysteries and things just like this. Oh, my stars and stockings! Just think of having a book lived right under your nose just like this, and me not knowing it all this time. Now tell me everything, he said, Miss Pollyanna, there's a dear. No wonder he took to you. No wonder. But he didn't, cried Pollyanna, not till I talked to him first. And he didn't even know who I was till I took the calf's foot jelly and had to make him understand that Aunt Polly didn't send it, and... Nancy sprang to her feet and clasped her hands together suddenly. "Oh, Miss Pollyanna, I know!" she exulted rapturously. The next minute she was down at Pollyanna's side again. "Tell me, now think and answer straight and true," she urged excitedly. "It was after he found out you was Miss Polly's niece that he said he didn't ever want to see you again, wasn't it?" "Oh, yes. I told him that the last time I saw him, and he told me this today." "I thought as much," triumphed Nancy.
And Miss Polly wouldn't send the jelly herself, would she? No. And you told him she didn't send it? Why, yes, And he began to act queer and cry out sudden after he found out that you was her niece. He did that, didn't he? Why, yes, he did act a little queer over that jelly, admitted Pollyanna with a thoughtful frown. Nancy drew a long sigh. Then I've got it, sure. Now listen. Mr. John Pendleton was Miss Polly Harrington's lover, she announced impressively, but with a furtive glance over her shoulder. Why, Nancy, he couldn't be. She doesn't like him, objected Pollyanna. Nancy gave her a scornful glance. Of course she don't. That's the quarrel. Pollyanna still looked incredulous, and with another long breath, Nancy happily settled herself to tell the story. It's like this. Just before you come, Mr. Tom told me Miss Polly had had a lover once. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. Her and a lover? But Mr. Tom said she had, and that he was living right now in this town, and now I know, of course. It's John Pendleton. Hasn't he got a mystery in his life? Don't he shut himself up in that grand house alone and never speak to no one? Didn't he act queer when he found out you was Miss Polly's niece? And now, hasn't he owned up that you remind him of something he wants to forget? Just as if anybody couldn't see it was Miss Polly. And her saying she wouldn't send him no jelly, too. Why, Miss Pollyanna, it's as plain as the nose on your face. It is. Oh, breathed Pollyanna in wide-eyed amazement. But Nancy, I should think if they loved each other, they'd make up sometime. Both of 'em all alone so, all these years. I should think they'd be glad to make up. Nancy sniffed disdainfully. I guess maybe you don't know much about lovers, Miss Pollyanna. You ain't big enough yet, anyhow. But if there is a set of folks in this world that wouldn't have no use for that there glad game of yourn, it'd be a pair of quarrelin' lovers. And that's what they be. Ain't he as cross as sticks most generally? And ain't she— Nancy stopped abruptly, remembering just in time to whom and about whom she was speaking. Suddenly, however, she chuckled. I ain't saying, though, Miss Pollyanna, but what it would be a pretty slick piece of business if you could get 'em to play in it, so they would be glad to make up. But my land, wouldn't folks stare some? Miss Polly and him! I guess, though, there ain't much chance. Pollyanna said nothing, but when she went into the house a little later, her face was very thoughtful. Chapter 18. Prisms. As the warm August days passed, Pollyanna went very frequently to the great house on Pendleton Hill. She did not feel, however, that her visits were really a success. Not but the man seemed to want her there. He sent for her indeed frequently, but that when she was there, he seemed scarcely any the happier for her presence, at least so Pollyanna thought. He talked to her, it was true, and he showed her many strange and beautiful things, pictures and books and curios, but he still fretted audibly over his own helplessness, and he chafed visibly under the rules and regulatings of the unwelcome members of his household. He did indeed seem to like to hear Pollyanna talk, however, and Pollyanna talked. Pollyanna liked to talk, but she was never sure that she would not look up and find him lying back on his pillow, with that white, hurt look that always pained her, and she was never sure which, if any, of her words had brought it there. As for telling him the glad game, and trying to get him to play it, Pollyanna had never seen the time yet when she thought he would care to hear about it. She had twice tried to tell him, but neither time had she got beyond the beginning of what her father had said. John Pendleton had on each occasion turned the conversation abruptly to another subject. Pollyanna never doubted now that John Pendleton was her Aunt Polly's one-time lover, and with all the strength of her loving, loyal heart, she wished she could in some way bring happiness into their, to her mind, miserably lonely lives. Just how she was to do this, however, she could not see.
She talked to Mr. Pendleton about her aunt, and he listened, sometimes politely, sometimes irritably, frequently with a rather quizzical smile on his usually stern lips. She talked to her aunt about Mr. Pendleton, or rather, she tried to talk to her about him. As a general thing, however, Miss Polly would not listen long. She always found something else to talk about. She frequently did that, however, when Pollyanna was talking of others, of Dr. Chilton, for instance. Pollyanna laid this, though, to the fact that it had been Dr. Chilton who had seen her in the sun parlor, with the rose in her hair, and the lace shawl draped about her shoulders. Aunt Polly, indeed, seemed particularly bitter against Dr. Chilton, as Pollyanna found out one day, when a hard cold shut her up in the house. "If you're not better by night, I shall send for the doctor," Aunt Polly said. "Shall you? Then I'm going to be worse," gurgled Pollyanna. "I'd love to have Dr. Chilton come and see me." She wondered then at the look that came to her aunt's face. "It will not be Dr. Chilton, Pollyanna," Miss Polly said sternly. "Dr. Chilton is not our family physician. I shall send for Dr. Warren if you are worse." Pollyanna did not grow worse, however, and Dr. Warren was not summoned. "I'm so glad, too," Pollyanna said to her aunt that evening. "Of course, I like Dr. Warren and all, but I like Dr. Chilton better, and I'm afraid he'd feel hurt if I didn't have him. You see, he wasn't really to blame after all that he happened to see you when I dressed you up so pretty that day, Aunt Polly," she finished wistfully. "That will do, Pollyanna. I really do not wish to discuss Dr. Chilton or his feelings," reproved Miss Polly decisively. Pollyanna looked at her for a moment with mournfully interested eyes, and then she sighed. "I just love to see you when your cheeks are pink like that, Aunt Polly. But I would so like to fix your hair. Why, Aunt Polly!" But her aunt was already out of sight down the hall. It was toward the end of August that Pollyanna, making an early morning call on John Pendleton, found the flaming band of blue and gold and green, edged with red and violet, lying across his pillow. She stopped short in awed delight. "Why, Mr. Pendleton, it's a baby rainbow!" "A real rainbow come in to pay you a visit," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together softly. "Oh, oh, oh, how pretty it is!" "But how did it get in?" she cried. The man laughed a little grimly. John Pendleton was particularly out of sorts with the world this morning. "Well, I suppose it got in through the beveled edge of that glass thermometer in the window," he said wearily. "The sun shouldn't strike it at all, but it does in the morning." "Oh, but it's so pretty, Mr. Pendleton. And does just the sun do that? My! If it was mine, I'd have it hang in the sun all day long."
"Lots of good you'd get out of the thermometer then," laughed the man. "How do you suppose you could tell how hot it was, or how cold it was, if the thermometer hung in the sun all day?"
"I shouldn't care," breathed Pollyanna, her fascinated eyes on the brilliant band of colors across the pillow. "Just as if anybody'd care when they were living all the time in a rainbow." The man laughed. He was watching Pollyanna's rapt face a little curiously. Suddenly, a new thought came to him. He touched the bell at his side.
"Nora," he said,
when the elderly maid appeared at the door,
"bring me one of those big brass candlesticks from the mantel in the front drawing-room."
"Yes, sir," murmured the woman, looking slightly dazed. In a minute, she had returned. A musical tinkling entered the room with her as she advanced wonderingly toward the bed. It came from the prism pendants encircling the old-fashioned candelabrum in her hand.
"Thank you. You may set it here on the stand," directed the man. "Now get a string and fasten it to the sash curtain fixtures of that window there. Take down the sash curtain and let the string reach straight across the window from side to side. That will be all. Thank you,"
he said when she had carried out his directions. As she left the room, he turned smiling eyes toward the wondering Pollyanna.
"Bring me the candlestick now, please, Pollyanna."
With both hands she brought it, and in a moment he was slipping off the pendants,
one by one, until they lay, a round dozen of them, side by side on the bed. "Now, my dear, suppose you take them and hook them to that little string Nora fixed across the window. If you really want to live in a rainbow, I don't see but we'll have to have a rainbow for you to live in." Pollyanna had not hung up 3 of the pendants in the sunlit window before she saw a little of what was going to happen. She was so excited then, she could scarcely control her shaking fingers enough to hang up the rest. But at last her task was finished, and she stepped back with a low cry of delight. It had become a fairyland, that sumptuous but dreary bedroom. Everywhere were bits of dancing red and green, violet and orange, gold and blue. The wall, the floor, and the furniture, even to the bed itself, were aflame with shimmering bits of color. "Oh, oh, oh, how lovely!" breathed Pollyanna. Then she laughed suddenly. "I just reckon the sun himself is trying to play the game now, don't you?" she cried, forgetting for the moment that Mr. Pendleton could not know what she was talking about. "Oh, how I wish I had a lot of those things! How I would like to give them to Aunt Polly and Mrs. Snow and lots of folks. I reckon then they'd be glad all right. Why, I think even Aunt Polly'd get so glad she couldn't help banging doors if she lived in a rainbow like that, don't you?" Mr. Pendleton laughed. "Well, from my remembrance of your aunt, Miss Pollyanna, I must say I think it would take something far more than a few prisms in the sunlight to make her bang many doors for gladness. But come now, really, what do you mean?" Pollyanna stared slightly. Then she drew a long breath. "Oh, I forgot. You don't know about the game. I remember now." "Suppose you tell me, then." And this time Pollyanna told him. She told him the whole thing from the very first, from the crutches that should have been a doll. As she talked, she did not look at his face. Her rapt eyes were still on the dancing flecks of color from the prism pendants swaying in the sunlit window. And that's all," she sighed when she had finished. "And now you know why I said the sun was trying to play it, that game." For a moment there was silence. Then a low voice from the bed said unsteadily, "Perhaps, but I'm thinking that the very finest prism of them all is yourself, Pollyanna." "Oh, but I don't show beautiful red and green and purple when the sun shines through me, Mr. Pendleton." "Don't you?" smiled the man. And Pollyanna, looking into his face, wondered why there were tears in his eyes. "No," she said. Then after a minute she added mournfully, "I'm afraid, Mr. Pendleton, the sun doesn't make anything but freckles out of me." The man laughed a little, and again Pollyanna looked at him. The laugh had sounded almost like a sob. Chapter 19, which is somewhat surprising. Pollyanna entered school in September. Preliminary examinations showed that she was well advanced for a girl of her years, and she was soon a happy member of a class of girls and boys her own age. School, in some ways, was a surprise to Pollyanna, and Pollyanna certainly in many ways was very much of a surprise to the school. They were soon on the very best of terms, however, and to her aunt, Pollyanna confessed that going to school was living after all, though she had had her doubts before. In spite of her delight in her new work, Pollyanna did not forget her old friends. True, she could not give them quite so much time now, of course, but she gave them what time she could. Perhaps John Pendleton of them all, however, was the most dissatisfied. One Saturday afternoon he spoke to her about it. "See here, Pollyanna, how would you like to come and live with me?" he asked a little impatiently. "I don't see anything of you nowadays." Pollyanna laughed. Mr. Pendleton was such a funny man. I thought you didn't like to have folks round," she said. He made a wry face. "Oh, but that was before you taught me to play that wonderful game of yours. Now I'm glad to be waited on hand and foot. Never mind, I'll be on my own 2 feet yet one of these days, and then I'll see who steps around," he finished, picking up one of the crutches at his side and shaking it playfully at the little girl. They were sitting in the great library today. "Oh, but you aren't really glad at all for things. You just say you are," pouted Pollyanna, her eyes on the dog dozing before the fire. "You know you don't play the game right, ever, Mr. Pendleton. You know you don't." The man's face grew suddenly very grave. "That's why I want you, little girl, to help me play it. Will you come?" Pollyanna turned in surprise. "Mr. Pendleton, you don't really mean that?" "I do. I want you. Will you come?" Pollyanna looked distressed. "Why, Mr. Pendleton, I can't. You know I can't. Why, I'm Aunt Polly's." A quick something crossed the man's face that Pollyanna could not quite understand. His head came up almost fiercely. "You're no more hers than... perhaps she would let you come to me," he finished more gently. "Would you come if she did?" Pollyanna frowned in deep thought. "But Aunt Polly has been so good to me," she began slowly. "And she took me when I didn't have anybody left but the Ladies' Aid, and..." Again that spasm of something crossed the man's face, but this time when he spoke, his voice was low and very sad. "Pollyanna, long years ago I loved somebody very much. I hoped to bring her some day to this house. I pictured how happy we'd be together in our home all the long years to come." "Yes," pitied Pollyanna, her eyes shining with sympathy. "But, well, I didn't bring her here. Never mind why, I just didn't, that's all. And ever since then this great gray pile of stone has been a house, never a home. It takes a woman's hand and heart or a child's presence to make it a home. Pollyanna, I have not had either. Now will you come, my dear?" Pollyanna sprang to her feet. Her face was fairly illumined. "Mr. Pendleton, you mean that you wish you had that woman's hand and heart all this time?" Why, yes, Pollyanna." "Oh, I'm so glad. Then it's all right," sighed the little girl. "Now you can take us both and everything will be lovely." "Take you both?" repeated the man dazedly. A faint doubt crossed Pollyanna's countenance. "Well, of course Aunt Polly isn't won over yet, but I'm sure she will be if you tell it to her just as you told to me, and then we'd both come, of course." A look of actual terror leaped to the man's eyes. "Aunt Polly? Come here?" Pollyanna's eyes widened a little. "Would you rather go there?" she asked. "Of course, the house isn't so pretty, but it's nearer." "Pollyanna, what are you talking about?" asked the man very gently now. "Why, about where we're going to live, of course," rejoined Pollyanna, in obvious surprise. "I thought you meant here at first. You said it was here that you had wanted Aunt Polly's hand and heart all those years to make a home, and..." An inarticulate cry came from the man's throat. He raised his hand and began to speak, but the next moment he dropped his hand nervelessly at his side. "The doctor, sir," said the maid in the doorway. Pollyanna rose at once. John Pendleton turned to her feverishly. "Pollyanna, for heaven's sake, say nothing of what I asked you yet," he begged in a low voice. Pollyanna dimpled into a sunny smile. "Of course not. Just as if I didn't know you'd rather tell her yourself," she called back merrily over her shoulder. John Pendleton fell limply back in his chair. "Why, what's up?" demanded the doctor a minute later, his fingers on his patient's galloping pulse. A whimsical smile trembled on John Pendleton's lips. "Overdose of your tonic, I guess," he laughed, as he noted the doctor's eyes following Pollyanna's little figure down the driveway. Chapter 20. Which is more surprising? Sunday mornings, Pollyanna usually attended church and Sunday school. Sunday afternoons, she frequently went for a walk with Nancy. She had planned one for the day after her Saturday afternoon visit to Mr. John Pendleton, but on the way home from Sunday school,
Dr. Chilton overtook her in his gig and brought his horse to a stop.
"Suppose you let me drive you home, Pollyanna," he suggested. "I want to speak to you a minute. I was just driving out to your place to tell you," he went on, as Pollyanna settled herself at his side. "Mr. Pendleton sent a special request for you to go and see him this afternoon. Sure. He says it's very important."
Pollyanna nodded happily. "Yes, it is, I know. I'll go." The doctor eyed her with some surprise.
"I'm not sure I should let you after all," he declared, his eyes twinkling. "You seemed more upsetting than soothing yesterday, young lady."
Pollyanna laughed. "Oh, it wasn't me, truly, not really, not so much as it was Aunt Polly." The doctor turned with a quick start.
Your aunt?" he ejaculated.
Pollyanna gave a happy little bounce in her seat. "Yes, and it's so exciting and lovely, just like a story, I'm going to tell you," she burst out with sudden decision. "He said not to mention it, but he wouldn't mind your knowing, of course. He meant not to mention it to her."
"Her?"
"Yes, Aunt Polly. And of course he would want to tell her himself instead of having me do it. Lovers, so."
"Lovers?"
As the doctor said the word, the horse started violently, as if the hand that held the reins had given them a sharp jerk. "Yes," nodded Pollyanna happily. "That's the story part, you see. I didn't know it till Nancy told me. She said Aunt Polly had a lover years ago and they quarreled. She didn't know who it was at first, but we've found out now. It's Mr. Pendleton, The doctor relaxed suddenly. The hand holding the reins fell limply to his lap.
"Oh, no, I didn't know," he said quietly.
Pollyanna hurried on. They were nearing the Harrington homestead. "Yes, and I'm so glad now. It's come out lovely. Mr. Pendleton asked me to come and live with him, but of course I wouldn't leave Aunt Polly like that, after she'd been so good to me. Then he told me all about the woman's hand and heart that he used to want, and I found out that he wanted it now, and I was so glad, for of course, if he wants to make up the quarrel, everything will be all right now, and Aunt Polly and I will both go to live there, or else he'll come to live with us. Of course, Aunt Polly doesn't know yet, and we haven't got everything settled, so I suppose that's why he wanted to see me this afternoon for sure." The doctor sat suddenly erect. There was an odd smile on his lips.
"Yes, I can well imagine that Mr. John Pendleton does want to see you, Pollyanna," he nodded as he pulled his horse to a stop before the door.
"There's Aunt Polly now in the window," cried Pollyanna. Then a second later, "Why, no, she isn't there, but I thought I saw her."
"No, she isn't there now," said the doctor.
His lips had suddenly lost their smile. Pollyanna found a very nervous John Pendleton waiting for her that afternoon.
"Pollyanna," he began at once, "I've been trying all night to puzzle out what you meant by all that yesterday about my wanting your Aunt Polly's hand and heart. All those years. What did you mean?"
"Why, because you were lovers, once, and I was so glad you still felt that way now."
"Lovers? Your Aunt Polly and I?"
At the obvious surprise in the man's voice, Pollyanna opened wide her eyes. "Why, Mr. Pendleton, Nancy said you were."
The man gave a short little laugh. "Well, I'm afraid I shall have to say that Nancy didn't know."
"Then you weren't lovers?" Pollyanna's voice was tragic with dismay.
"Never."
"And it isn't all coming out like a book?" There was no answer. The man's eyes were moodily fixed out the window. "Oh, dear, and it was all going so splendidly," almost sobbed Pollyanna. "I'd have been so glad to come with Aunt Polly."
"And you won't now?"
The man asked the question without turning his head. "Of course not. I'm Aunt Polly's." The man turned now almost fiercely.
"Before you were hers, Pollyanna, you were your mother's. And it was your mother's hand and heart that I wanted long years ago."
"My mother's?"
"Yes. I had not meant to tell you, but perhaps it's better after all that I do, now."
John Pendleton's face had grown very white. He was speaking with evident difficulty. Pollyanna, her eyes wide and frightened and her lips parted, was gazing at him fixedly.
I loved your mother, but she didn't love me. And after a time she went away with your father. I did not know until then how much I did care. The whole world suddenly seemed to turn black under my fingers but never mind. For long years I have been a cross-crabbed, unlovable, unloved old man. Though I'm not nearly 60 yet, Pollyanna. Then, one day, like one of the prisms that you love so well, little girl, you danced into my life and flecked my old dreary world with dashes of the purple and gold and scarlet of your own bright cheeriness. I found out after a time who you were, and I thought then that I never wanted to see you again. I didn't want to be reminded of your mother. But you know how that came out, and I just had to have you come. And now I want you always, Pollyanna. Won't you come now?
But Mr. Pendleton, there's Aunt Polly. Pollyanna's eyes were blurred with tears. The man made an impatient gesture.
What about me? How do you suppose I'm going to be glad about anything without you? Why, Pollyanna, it's only since you came that I've been even half glad to live. But if I had you for my own dear little girl, I'd be glad for anything. And I'd try to make you glad too, my dear. You shouldn't have a wish ungratified. All my money to the last cent should go to make you happy.
Pollyanna looked shocked. Why, Mr. Pendleton, as if I'd let you spend it on me, all the money that you've saved for the needy. A dull red came to the man's face. He started to speak, but Pollyanna was still talking. Besides, anybody with such a lot of money as you have doesn't need me to make you glad about things. You're making other folks so glad giving them things that you can't help being glad yourself. Why, look at those prisms you gave Mrs. Snow and me, and the gold piece you gave Nancy on her birthday, and—
Yes, never mind about all that, interrupted the man.
His face was very, very red now, and no wonder, perhaps. It was not for giving things that John Pendleton had been best known in the past.
That's all nonsense. 'Twasn't much, anyhow, but what there was because of you. You gave those things, not I. Yes, you did, he repeated in answer to the shocked denial in her face. And that only goes to prove all the more how much I need you, little girl, he added, his voice softening into tender pleading once more. If ever I'm to play the glad game, Pollyanna, you'll have to come and play it with me.
The little girl's forehead puckered into a wistful frown. Aunt Polly has been so good to me, she began, but the man interrupted her sharply. The old irritability had come back to his face. Impatience, which would brook no opposition, had been a part of John Pendleton's nature too long to yield very easily now to restraint.
Of course she's been good to you, but she doesn't want you, I'll warrant. Half so much as I do, he contested.
Why, Mr. Pendleton, she's glad, I know, to have—
Glad, interrupted the man, thoroughly losing his patience now. I'll wager Miss Polly doesn't know how to be glad for anything. Oh, she does her duty, I know. She's a very dutiful woman. I've had experience with her duty before. I'll acknowledge we haven't been the very best of friends for the past 15 or 20 years, but I know her. Everyone knows her, and she isn't the glad kind, Pollyanna. She doesn't know how to be. As for your coming to me, you just ask her and see if she won't let you come. And oh, little girl, I want you so, he finished brokenly.
Pollyanna rose to her feet with a long sigh. All right, I'll ask her, she said wistfully. Of course, I don't mean I wouldn't like to live here with you, Mr. Pendleton, but— She did not complete her sentence. There was a moment's silence. Then she added, Well, anyhow, I'm glad I didn't tell her yesterday, 'cause then I supposed she was wanted, too. John Pendleton smiled grimly.
Well, yes, Pollyanna, I guess it's just as well you didn't mention it yesterday. I didn't. Only to the doctor, and of course he doesn't count. The doctor? Cried John Pendleton, turning quickly. Not Dr. Chilton? Yes, when he came to tell me you wanted to see me today, you know. Well, of all the... muttered the man, falling back in his chair. Then he sat up with sudden interest. And what did Dr. Chilton say? He asked. Pollyanna frowned thoughtfully. Why, I don't remember. Not much, I reckon. Oh, he did say he could well imagine you did want to see me. Oh, did he indeed? Answered John Pendleton. And Pollyanna wondered why he gave that sudden, queer little laugh.
This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Pollyanna. I'd love to hear from you, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.